against quality education in this country, but the Gallup poll, the Harris poll, and every other poll shows that 75 to 85% of the American people are against the senseless, asinine busing of little school children to achieve racial balance throughout the United States. I can tell you that any party that doesn't confront this issue and confront it in the right manner is going to be in jeopardy as far as success is concerned this coming November.
Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The noes have it.
That what we are seeing here is a rising sun. I feel that way about this campaign. I know that according to all the reports in the press, we're beginning this presidential effort in an underdog role. But that's the way John Kennedy began in 1960. That's the way Harry Truman began in 1948. That's the way many campaigns have started that have ended in victory. And I want to say here this morning that deep in my soul, I'm convinced the people of this country have had enough of Richard Nixon, and we're going to have a Democratic victory.
The third reality is the presence of several million Palestinians with their own history, but with an uncertain future and an unsatisfactory present. And they are entitled to an independent national homeland of their own. Now, there are various ways that these realities of the Middle East can be interpreted and acted upon, but the goal must be the peace, prosperity, and dignity of all the peoples of the Middle East.
Would you care to let us know where do you vision the territory that such a homeland would be established on?
Well, there seems to be a growing consensus on the part of people that we have talked with in the Middle East that one possibility, one practical possibility would be the area now referred to as the West Bank and the Gaza area. I don't know whether that's the best way to do it or not, but it would seem to be one practical possibility. Perhaps some kind of interim arrangement worked out before the government was elected, or the government was decided, or even the permanent relationship of such an area, let us say to the state of Jordan or to the state of Israel, were resolved. There might have to be an interim period, perhaps followed by a plebiscite. But these are matters that are details and specifics, and I don't want to be permanently held here today to any specific formula, other than the general principle that we have to work out some kind of an arrangement for an independent state. This matter of the West Bank and the Gaza area is one formula that's frequently suggested as one travels through the Middle East.
America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. That prayer is our promise. And how fortunate we are, how fortunate is America to find that promise in the wise and skillful hands of our leader, the senator from South Dakota and the next president of the United States, George McGovern. From secrecy and deception in high places, come home, America. From military spending so wasteful that it weakens our nation, come home, America. From the entrenchment of special privilege and tax favoritism, from the waste of idle hands to the joy of useful labor, from the prejudice based on race and sex, from the loneliness of the aging poor and the despair of the neglected sick. Come home, America. Come home to the affirmation that we have a dream. Come home to the conviction that we can move our country forward. Come home to the belief that we can seek a newer world. And let us be joyful in the homecoming. For this land
This is the man who hopes to snatch the presidency away from Richard Nixon. Senator George McGovern, the Democratic contender from South Dakota.
If we can figure out some way to do it directly with the individual student, like we did on the GI Bill. Yeah.
But though he can bring out the crowds, he's over 20 points behind in the opinion polls. It's a sobering thought for his supporters that no candidate in U.S. history has ever made up so large a gap so late in the campaign. And it must be admitted that George McGovern doesn't look like doing so either. McGovern's candidacy began well enough. It got an immediate response from the young and from many people in the news media, the same sort of support that Eugene McCarthy captured in the early days of the 1968 campaign. Rooting for McGovern was the in thing for the young and the liberals. In the primary campaigns, McGovern's meetings took on the atmosphere of political crusades as the Democratic contender preached a new brand of politics.
Now, very frankly, I think this is another victory of the new politics over the old. It's a little bit humbling to the candidate to do as well as we did in Rhode Island, where I didn't even make an appearance. But what that indicates to me is that this is basically a great effort in this country that does not depend on the efforts of one man, not on the candidate alone, but it depends on the dedication of a great army of people that are determined to turn this country in a new direction.
Whilst President Nixon was striding across the world stage, Senator McGovern had to be content with merely saying what he'd do if he were elected. On the war in Vietnam, his message was clear and unequivocal.
I welcome the long years of identification in opposition to this war. I still regard it as the most tragic mistake in all the history of this country. And I want every man and woman in this room and everyone within the sound of my voice to know that there is no higher or more sacred pledge that I take in this campaign for the presidency of the United States than my determination that if we win that election on November 7th and I'm inaugurated next January, we're going to end our military involvement in that tragedy once and for all. No secret plans, no secret deals, simply a recognition that we've got to love this country enough and put its interest high enough so that we recognize at long last the time has come to stop this senseless killing and tragedy and waste that is draining the very soul of this nation. I'm dedicated to that end, and I ask for your help in restoring this country to peace abroad restoring our confidence here at home, and getting on with making America the kind of a great and good land that I think our people want it to be. Thank you very much.
On the domestic issues, Senator McGovern's been attacking President Nixon's handling of the economy, perhaps the most vulnerable area of the administration's record. Unemployment throughout this year has continued to hover between 5 and 6%, despite President Nixon's sweeping policy changes last year. Senator McGovern has tried to link the Vietnam and economy issues. Inflation, he says, is the result of the war, and unemployment the result of inflation, and both are unjust and unnecessary. The Democratic candidate also proposed radical tax and Social Security reforms. He caused a sensation early in the campaign by announcing plans to give $1,000 to every man, woman and child in the land. Such promises were received with incredulity by many people who wanted to know how the money could be found without increasing taxes to punitive levels. Senator McGovern ventured into Wall Street to defend his reforms against charges that they'd bankrupt the nation.
Taken together, the tax justice or tax reforms and the military cutbacks I have proposed would approximate $54 billion. The total cost of additions to the national budget by a Democratic administration would be less than that amount. Only with new revenues and different priorities can we move forward with new programs. And that, it seems to me, is the fundamental choice before the American people in 1972. Money made by money should be taxed at the same rate as money made by men. And tax justice demands equal treatment for Americans who earn their living with a shovel or a slide rule and Americans who live on stock market and property gains. This year, you should ask yourselves whether you really prefer to be stranded on a sea of sluggish growth with tax loopholes, your only consolation, or whether you're able to accept both higher profits and fairer taxes at the same time. After all, even a tax loophole is no help if you have no income to be taxed. And the Nixon tactic is that the McGovern tax reform would force Americans to pay half of their income in taxes. The fact is that these proposals would take only an extra 1.5% of our gross national product in taxes, and no American whose income comes from wages and salaries will pay 1 penny more in federal taxes than he does now. Finally, the Nixon position is that real tax reform would damage investment and destroy initiative. The McGovern position is that business and investors can prosper in an equitable society. I favor tax justice.
Senator McGovern's campaign would have aroused more enthusiasm but for a disastrous episode just after he was nominated.
I charge no one with malice insofar as spreading these rumors are concerned, but I think it is a legitimate question that the press has to ask of me as to whether my health is such that I can hold the high office of Vice President of the United States. On 3 occasions in my life, I have voluntarily gone into hospitals as a result of nervous exhaustion and fatigue. Few in this room know me well. Tom Ottenad of the Post-Dispatch,
This
Ed
man
O'Brien
was
of the
Senator
St. Louis
McGovern's
Democrat,
first choice for
and a
vice
few others
president,
have followed my
Senator
career.
Thomas Eagleton of Missouri.
And they know me to be, I think, a
Senator
rather
Eagleton
intense,
accepted Mr.
hard-driving
McGovern's
person.
invitation with enthusiasm. But when it
Your
was
reaction to
disclosed
what,
that he received hospital treatment for nervous
Let
disorders
me
on
say,
3
Mr.
separate
Shoemaker,
occasions,
that when I
Senator
talked,
McGovern was faced with
to
the
Senator
agonizing
Eagleton
choice
about
between
my,
defending his
decision
running mate
to
or
ask
dropping
him
him.
to go as my running mate. I asked him if there were any problems in his past that he thought were significant, that were worth discussing with me at that time, and he said no, and I agree with that. I'm fully satisfied.
Public discussion of Eagleton's fitness for office ran on for days before Senator McGovern finally asked Mr. Eagleton to step down.
Manifests in Senator Eagleton's part is the good judgment.
The whole episode was widely seen as an error of judgment by Senator McGovern. Eagleton was blamed for withholding such vital information, but the general feeling was that Senator McGovern should have found out anyway. And the Senator's vacillation about what to do once the news broke gave an impression of indecisiveness, the worst possible effect for a man aspiring to be president.
And if I had known every detail that he discussed with me this morning, which is exactly what he has just told you here now, he would still have been my choice.
Things went from bad to worse for Senator McGovern when his next choice for vice president, Edmund Muskie, refused to serve. Finally, Sergeant Shriver, one-time leader of the Peace Corps under President Kennedy, agreed to join the ticket. But the damage was done. Despite hard campaigning, the Democrats had suffered a setback from which they'd never really recovered. The Democrats hit back as best they could and gained some political capital from a break-in to the National Democratic Party headquarters at their Watergate offices in New York. 7 men, including 2 former White House aides, were indicted on charges of trying to bug the headquarters in June to discover the secrets of the Democrats' election strategy. Since then, Senator McGovern's used the case as the foundation of his charges that President Nixon's administration is the most corrupt in American history. Other scandals involving Republicans have also been given wide publicity, but there are few signs that the senator's allegations are stirring any concern in the electorate, most of whom seem to view the revelations with apathy, even cynicism. For Senator McGovern, the great irony of the 1972 campaign is that he began as the attacker and is ending as the defender. For the Democrats, the campaign was to have been about the character and trustworthiness of President Nixon. Instead, it's somehow become transformed into a discussion of the personality and credibility of Senator McGovern. The Democratic candidate has made many radical promises in this campaign, but he's been unable to project himself as a strong, decisive leader, and he's apparently failed to convince the majority of Americans of the need for a new kind of politics. As the campaign's grown older, morale has sagged and the money's dried up. The McGovern bandwagon, which seemed such an unstoppable force in the primaries, has now slowed to a crawl. So, when the votes are counted on November the 7th, the final verdict on the 72 campaign might well be that it was not so much an election won by President Nixon as a contest lost by Senator McGovern.
Yes, because I've been here 30 years, like 18 years ago. I get out and sit in the background.
We need to end government by special interest. We need to end a leadership that promises one thing in public while plotting an entirely different course behind closed doors in secret. In the last 3 years, we have seen secret deals with ITT that have corrupted the antitrust legislation of this country.
The street's not violent.
We're going to forgive now. The war's behind us. We're actually even going to help rebuild the damage. And then to say to these young Americans who refused to participate in the war, some of them went to jail, some of them went to Canada, to say to them, you're not going to be forgiven. If you come back to this country, you're going to go to jail.
you're going to pay a criminal penalty. On what basis are we softer towards the enemy who was shooting at us until a few days ago? We're kinder and more forgiving and more compassionate towards them than we are to these young men who were tortured in mind and conscience in many cases and left their homes rather than to participate in this war. Why can't the healing of the wounds extend to everybody?
Why shouldn't these young men who deserted their country, why shouldn't they take the consequences? Why shouldn't they comply with the processes that Congress has provided and come back and take the medicine? That doesn't mean they won't be ever forgiven, but why aren't they required to comply with legal processes? Now, this doesn't mean lack of compassion. We're just as compassionate as you are. I have the same compassion I'm sure the President does. We regret it. We regret that some fellows shirked their duties and others had to serve. Others had to be killed or maimed because these fellows shirked their duties.
The misfortunes of Edmund Muskie were one of the big surprises so far this election year. Today, Muskie initiated a surprise of his own. The scene was the National Press Club here in Washington. The crowd was large because of what they expected the senator from Maine to say, but he didn't say it. ABC's Frank Reynolds reports.
Muskie walked into a room filled with people expecting him to announce his endorsement of Senator McGovern. Early in his speech, however, it became apparent he had no such intention.
Party unity is not achieved with the magic wand of the kingmaker. No man can hand George McGovern a united party. For my part, I will continue as a candidate for my party's nomination.
With a completely straight face, Muskie later denied that he was part of a Stop McGovern movement.
I have no element of Stop McGovern. I have no negative objectives in view. I have no unrealistic hopes for myself. There are no blinders on me at all. And I understand the political risks I run in pursuing this uphill and long shot course. But there is still an obligation. I tried to articulate today an obligation to let this convention work its will.
Senator McGovern was in New York City when he heard of Muskie's decision not to endorse him, and McGovern told reporters he felt that the decision was really the right one, that Muskie was paying a compliment to rank-and-file Democrats. Those Democrats, said McGovern, are going to make their judgment without relying on the big names. More on McGovern from ABC's Lem Tucker.
The large voting bloc at the Miami Democratic Convention will be the 278-member New York delegation. George McGovern took note of that fact this morning when he opened his New York campaign. He said the June 20th primary here may be the most important one. Then someone asked him about reports that large numbers of Democrats would desert the party if he is nominated.
I think once the nomination is made, that the party will be far more united than we were in 1968. I intend to do everything in my power in the next few weeks and beyond the National Convention to reconcile the party and to bring it back together. I have no doubt the party will be united when we go into the fall campaign.
Then he was off for the city's Garment District, a heavily Jewish area. There he tried to set straight his record on support of Israel.
If I were President of the United States, I would see that American aid and American equipment is made available in whatever level is necessary to guarantee that this one free and democratic state in the Middle East survives.
Next, into a restaurant where he ate chopped liver with a glass of milk, had Ed Muskie's speech relayed to him from Washington, and then, with no outward sign that his confidence was breaking, he talked about Muskie's move, or lack of a move.
I think probably the senator's judgment was the improper one. I had hoped that we would get Senator Muskie's endorsement today, yes. I had hoped that we would have it. But as I've said, he reached a decision to leave this up to the delegates, and I really can't argue with that. As an advocate of an open convention, as an advocate of party reform, I can't argue with the senator's decision. I want you to...
Earlier in the day, before Muskie spoke, McGovern had said He thought a McGovern-Muskie slate would be a superb ticket. What he thought after the speech was uncertain. Next, a stop in Harlem, where he met with a small group of black journalists. McGovern told them he didn't think he had all, or even most of the answers to solving the racial problems of America. But he said he'd do all he could to set the proper moral tone for the nation. So on the first official day of his New York campaign, George McGovern touched base with Jewish voters and with black voters, both groups whose support he must have if he's to win this state. Lem Tucker, ABC News, New York.
Atlanta, Georgia, and the barriers are going up in preparation for a visit from America's most prominent citizen, President Richard Nixon. Next month, America votes for a new president, and Atlanta, if it were perfectly honest, would really prefer to vote for someone like George Wallace, just as it did 4 years ago, along with most of the other southern states. But this year, there's no Wallace, and so the South will vote solidly for Nixon and be glad to do so. The president doesn't evoke this sort of rapture everywhere, of course, but he is the popular choice. According to the opinion polls, he's so far ahead of his Democratic rival, Senator George McGovern, that he doesn't even need to do any campaigning. Trips like this are almost a self-indulgence. Amongst the adulation, a few protest banners reminded the president that some Americans at least disapproved of his policies. But for most of the crowd, Richard Nixon was something you couldn't have too much of. Even his sternest critics have had to admit that Richard Nixon has put up an amazing performance. His long political career has been punctuated by the sort of setbacks which would have finished a less durable figure, and his achievement in finally getting to the White House is a testimony to his sheer staying power. Nixon won the presidency by a hair's breadth. And what probably tipped the scales in his favor was his pre-election promise to end the Vietnam War and bring the boys home. The boys came home all right. The first withdrawals began in July 1969 and continued steadily throughout Nixon's presidency until by last month, the American strength in Vietnam had been reduced from well over 500,000 to fewer than 50,000, none of them combat troops. American casualties fell proportionately. And last September, for the first time in 7 years, a whole week went by without any American combat deaths. Bringing the boys home was one thing. Ending the war was quite another. On the ground, the South Vietnamese took over most of the fighting, but the war in the air continued to depend on American bombing raids, usually carried out by giant B-52s operating from Thailand. According to one recent calculation, the amount of bombs dropped over Indochina during the Nixon presidency is more than twice the tonnage dropped by the Allies over Europe, Asia, and Africa during the whole of World War II. At home, resentment against the war continued, and President Nixon, the candidate who'd vowed to bring peace, found himself branded as a war criminal, just as his predecessor, Lyndon Johnson, had been. In this demonstration on the steps of the Capitol in Washington, Vietnam veterans, many of them crippled, tore off their medals and flung them away in disgust. Far worse than this, however, were the events at Kent State University in Ohio 2 years ago. As on many other campuses across the nation, students at Kent demonstrated against Nixon's decision to send American troops into Cambodia, which they saw as an escalation of the war rather than an attempt to end it. National Guardsmen opened fire without warning on a crowd of students, killing 4 who were not even taking part in the demonstration. For many people, especially the young, it was a shocking example of the heavy-handed authoritarianism they saw thriving in Nixon's America, an impression only confirmed when the president referred to the students as these bums blowing up the campuses. The honeymoon period of popularity was over, and in the midterm elections, Democrats gained seats in the House of Representatives and captured a majority of the state governorships. As a result, President Nixon entered the second half of his term with Congress even more firmly under the control of his political opponents, who began increasingly to attack not only his handling of the war in Vietnam, but also his domestic policies. The strongest criticism centered on his handling of the economy. One of the consequences of the escalation of the Vietnam War under Lyndon Johnson was a high and increasing rate of inflation. When President Nixon took office, the effects of this were already being felt in every supermarket across the land. Prices in 1968 were 6% higher than the previous year, and throughout 1969, the first year of Nixon's administration, this upward trend continued. President Nixon tried to arrest inflation by restricting credit, but this only produced higher unemployment, which by May 1970 stood at its highest level for 5 years. The credit squeeze also depressed the stock market. In the first half of Nixon's presidency, prices on Wall Street fell from a record peak to their lowest level in 7 years. The American economy had got the worst of both worlds, inflation plus stagnation. The unbalance was reflected in America's deteriorating trade position with the rest of the world. Each year, America's balance of payments deficit broke new records, and by the middle of 1971, it was running at the staggering figure of $20,000 million a year. Confidence in the dollar as the prime currency for world trade rapidly evaporated, and in August 1971, this produced the worst international financial crisis since the war. President Nixon acted decisively. He suspended the dollar's convertibility against gold, imposed a 10% surcharge on most imports, and decreed a 90-day freeze on prices and wages. In doing so, he shattered at a stroke the system of world finance set up at the end of World War II. 4 months later, the dollar was devalued. But as the president entered election year, his new economic policy seemed to be paying off. In the first 6 months of 1972, inflation had slowed to less than 3%. Whatever his troubles at home, President Nixon let nothing stand in the way of his ambitious foreign policy. In February this year, he became the first American president ever to visit China. He'd recognized Peking, in effect, 6 months earlier, when he'd dropped the traditional U.S. opposition to China's entry into the United Nations. It was a remarkable evolution of policy by a man who'd started out his political career as an implacable foe of communism in all its forms. After being greeted by Premier Zhou Enlai, the president moved on to a wide-ranging tour of China, including a meeting with Chairman Mao Zedong himself. The personal confrontation symbolized just how quickly the barriers of mutual suspicion had fallen. The world's most populous nation and the world's most powerful one were talking to each other again, and Richard Nixon could take a fair slice of the credit. Following the China trip came an equally historic journey to the Soviet Union. Even as an out-of-office politician, Mr. Nixon had made it his business to maintain good personal contacts with the men in the Kremlin. As president, he'd promoted trade between the two countries and had seen the continuation of the SALT disarmament talks. For him, the visit was a fulfillment of his pledge to move the world from an era of confrontation to an era of negotiation. At the end of his visit, the President and Soviet First Secretary Leonid Brezhnev signed an historic agreement limiting the number of offensive missiles each nation could hold. It was the first positive move to reduce the arms race in over 25 years of talking. Taken together, the President's two trips were a major contribution towards the lessening of world tension. They also did much to enhance the President's reputation as a statesman and a man of action who actually gets things done. The message has not been lost on the American electorate. A great deal of the credit for these achievements must go to this man, Henry Kissinger, the President's special advisor and envoy extraordinary. The 49-year-old ex-Harvard professor has traveled the world on Nixon's behalf and has played a leading part in the negotiations with the North Vietnamese to find a formula for ending the Vietnam War. But in this election year, the credit for anything he's achieved has gone to President Nixon. For decades now, Americans have invariably re-elected their presidents for a second term, and there's no reason to believe President Nixon will be any exception. He's made some bad mistakes, and his current popularity is probably slightly puzzling even to himself. But he's consistently fulfilled his role as the voice of Middle America, and for that reason, if for no other, he seems certain to be back in the White House for 4 more years.
You never did it so good.
4 years ago, South Dakota Senator George McGovern waited 18 days before the Democratic National Convention to announce that he was a candidate for president. Well, he made up for that late start this time by jumping first into the 1972 race in January of 1971, 14 months ago this week. So far in the primary season, we've seen Senator McGovern do better than anticipated in New Hampshire, although still less well than Senator Edmund Muskie. Senator McGovern received 37% and Senator Muskie 48%. Well, with today's vote in Florida, the pollsters tell us that Senator McGovern will do less well than some among the 11 Democrats on the ballot, yet still better than others. So, good morning, Senator. And
good morning.
In view of the polls, if you again defy the pollsters and you make a strong showing here, how many better than anticipated, but still less well than some, can your campaign stand?
Well, I think the first thing I should do is to bring you the latest returns from New Hampshire. The absentee vote is now in, and the spread has further narrowed as of last night. It's now 46% for Senator Muskie and 37% for me, which gives us about a 9-point spread. No one in the country thought we would do that well. I would say here in Florida today that if we even come close to second place in a field of 11 candidates, that's a very remarkable showing. Consider, for example, that Mayor Lindsay, who did not enter New Hampshire and was able to concentrate everything on Florida, has spent perhaps as much as 8 or 9 times as much as I have on radio and television. So if we even come close to the showing of the other candidates, and I think we will, I think we're going to surprise people here again today. This is another victory in the moral sense of the word.
You think you may very well come in second place?
I think there's a chance. I think the races are going to be very closely grouped, and especially for second place. But we've been winning more than moral victories. We did a total last night on the number of delegates that we already have committed to my candidacy, and I lead the field at the present time. I've got 75 delegates. Now, this includes delegates who were picked in Georgia on Saturday under the new reform guidelines, where approximately half of them are black people, approximately half are women, about a third are young people under 30. So we are picking up delegates in states all over the country, not only in the primary system, but in these open caucuses and conventions.
Many people feel that in terms of being a viable candidate, that the race here, the competition here is between you and Mayor John Lindsay. Whatever your standing in regard to the other candidates, if you beat John Lindsay, will you consider it worthwhile you're having...
Well, I really didn't come down here to beat John Lindsay. I don't see him as the principal competition. I think in this state, the toughest contender was Mr. Wallace. I think Humphrey and Muskie and Jackson, all of these people are still very much in contention. What we want to do is get just as many delegates as we can out of Florida.
I understand that you made a sudden flight to Chicago this weekend to see the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Were you trying to entrench yourself in Mayor Daley country, or...
Well, not that. Reverend Jesse
Jackson
Jackson is one of the most dynamic black leaders in America today. He heads up a new organization called People United to Save Humanity. I think that's a wonderful phrase, and I wanted to be there to wish this organization well. Also, all the black leaders, virtually all of them from all over the country, were there, and I wanted to be in close contact with them.
Did you discuss the busing issue with them?
Yes, I discovered that both among blacks and whites, there's less consternation about this than the politicians might have you believe. That's right. Most people understand that this is a country that operates according to judicial procedures. And this is a complicated question which the Supreme Court has decided. I think tomorrow, or not tomorrow, here today in Florida, in this primary election, when the people go in those polling places with their conscience, they're going to realize that what is at stake here is the Constitution and the courts of the land, and I don't think they're going to vote to overturn the judicial process.
And you don't think it's going to be an issue in the other primaries?
I think it'll be a minor issue. I think it's one that the American people will put in perspective. They're more interested, for example, in whether their children are going to die in Vietnam than whether they're going to take a bus ride. They're more interested in the quality of the school at the end of the bus line than they are the length of the bus ride. They're more interested in whether they're going to get a job than they are in buses.
Well, I thank you, Senator McGovern. This is the third time that you've been on with us in, what, about 10 days? And I presume as the primaries go on, we'll be seeing more of you.
Well, we hope to be back with you in Illinois next Tuesday when that primary takes place.
Thank you for being with us today, Senator George McGovern. And we'll be back after this message.
It was here, at the General Motors Styling Center, that Buick decided to build the extraordinary car. A car like nobody else's. It started with drawings, then clay, and it evolved to this. The 1972 Buick Riviera. For people who don't want a car like everybody else's. For you, if you're daring enough. The 1972 Buick Riviera. Something to believe in.
You know, it is lovely for women's hair to be soft, and therefore you've probably never liked the hairsprays that can make hair stiff. Well, Protein 21 hairspray is designed to make hair not nearly as stiff. So how well can it hold? Beautifully. Because Protein 21 holds not just by sticking the top hairs together, but by reaching down and giving body to individual hair shafts. Protein 21 holds with body, so you can have hair that looks and feels the way you want it to.
We know the record of this administration on every issue, and the four horsemen of ancient name bore the names of war and pestilence, famine and death. And now in the government of Richard Nixon, the four horsemen are riding again, and they bear the names of incompetence, favoritism, secrecy, and corruption. Now tonight, let us say to the special interests, let us say to the wiretappers, let us say to the warmongers, give us back our country. We've just... Thank you. Say that any president who asks for 4 more years ought to explain to us what he's done with the last 4 years. And what is that record? Let's just look at it from the economic standpoint. This administration has given us the worst unemployment that we've had in 10 years. It's given us the worst inflation that we've had in 20 years. And every housewife here knows that's true. It's given us the worst federal deficits that we've had in 30 years. It's given us the first international trade deficit that this country has had since 1888, some 80 years ago. And it's given us the highest interest rates that this country has had in 100 years.
Now we must draw the painful conclusion that the events of recent weeks were not a path to peace, but a detour around Election Day. The officials who are sworn to serve you instead have sought to mislead you for their own political gain. Their strategy, I believe, was designed to create the illusion of peace from Thursday, October 26th, when Dr. Kissinger made his announcement, until Tuesday, November 7th, when you will make your decision about the next president of the United States. Now in a campaign that has been marked by falsehood, sabotage, secret funds, special interest deals, and actual criminal activity, this is the worst deceit of all. They have played politics with the Justice Department, the FBI, the Supreme Court, even the Constitution, and now they play politics with our prisoners and our soldiers and life itself. It is they who treat our men like toy soldiers to be knocked over by the hand that should protect them.
On Tuesday, the Democratic National Committee will meet to select a candidate for vice president. At that time, I will recommend the selection of Sergeant Shriver as my presidential running mate. Mr. Shriver has served with great distinction in a number of high and difficult public positions. President Kennedy chose him to organize and direct the Peace Corps, while under President Johnson, he was the first director of the Office of Economic Opportunity. He later served as ambassador to France under both President Johnson and President Nixon. A distinguished business leader, his life has been marked by a special dedication to the needs of the poor and to those who suffer from racial injustice. I am fully confident of his ability to serve as Vice President of the United States. We gather strength from the choice of Sergeant Shriver, who has inspired all of us with his contagious faith that our cause is going to prevail, and whose years of eloquent service bear witness to the ideals we seek for the future of this country. Sergeant Shriver sent the Peace Corps around the world, and in the next administration, America will send forth once more the message of peace on earth.
And I'm not embarrassed at all to be George McGovern's 7th choice for vice president. We Democrats may be short of money, but we're not short of talent. Think of the comparison, and then you can pity poor Mr. Nixon. His first and only choice was Spiro Agnew.
I don't often find myself in agreement with Vice President Key of South Vietnam with reference to this war, but I would like to draw attention to a statement that appeared over the wire from Saigon on yesterday, in which the Vice President of South Vietnam expresses grave reservations about the invasion of Laos. And this is what he has to say. Experiences in Cambodia have shown that it is not easy to withdraw from that country after a short operation for a few days. We must be very careful, otherwise we will come into a bogged-down situation in Laos.
Well, I have no doubt that President Nixon can be defeated. I think the American people are looking for a new type of leadership. When I was a boy growing up in South Dakota, I remember at that time that every American, every person I knew loved this country and was proud of it. It wasn't that we thought our leadership was perfect, but we thought our government was essentially worthy of our trust, that it was a good and decent land. And it's that kind of a leadership and that kind of an America that I want to restore again. I think the people are sick and tired of a war that never ends, which President Nixon has not ended. I think they're tired of a tax system that favors the powerful and penalizes the rest of us. I think they're tired of a leadership that tells us one thing in public while following a different course in private. And I believe the people of this country will respond to the kind of leadership that appeals
to what is best in us. In Lincoln's phrase, to the better angels of our nature. And if we build that kind of a leadership and that kind of a country, then I'm confident future generations in this country will love America not simply because they were born here, but because of the kind of a great and good country we've made it. That's why I want to be President of the United States. That's why I think I'm going to be nominated and elected. My highest economic priority is the lowest possible unemployment. This would be achieved through federal action to stimulate demand and open up jobs in the private sector, to contract with industry for housing, for public transportation, for water and sewer systems, and other things we urgently need, and to underwrite jobs in state and local government for the unemployed. Now, that program calls for an immediate $10 billion investment in new jobs, and it would invest an additional $6 billion each year in jobs for people who would otherwise be on welfare. Republican politicians say that we can't reach full employment with the cuts I would make in military waste. Now, they're right that I intend to end that waste, no matter what that does to the insatiable appetites of those who profit from war and rumors of war. But they are wrong when they say this will cause unemployment. In fact, it will create more employment. We do not need to send our sons to war in order to put their parents back to work. The same amount of money that will provide 1 million jobs building missiles and bombs will generate 1.5 million jobs in peaceful pursuits. And I have offered this pledge: no job that depends on the defense budget will be eliminated until there is a comparable civilian job to replace it. I want this nation to be militarily strong, but I also want us to heed General Eisenhower's warning that if the military takes too much, it actually weakens the nation. He's continuing the bombing, not to get our men out of prison, but to keep General II in power. And that's a price I'm not willing to pay. Let me just add one thing. One of the great problems that we've had in the leadership of this country is that we have had too many people that were unwilling to change their mind when they got new evidence. They were afraid they'd lose face, and so they wouldn't change. Now, I think we need a president who isn't afraid to say, I'm going to change my mind, I made a mistake. And sometimes you ought to be able to say to the people, this is not going to be popular, but this is what we're going to have to do to save our country. You have to make those hard decisions.
McGovern, Democrat, for the people.
I'm proud to present the man we're going to inaugurate next January, the senator from the Great Plains states of South Dakota, the next president of the United States, George McGovern. We're getting longer on that George McGovern every time. So, what I plead for here tonight is a new order of priorities. I'm pleased to read the reports that in the closing days of this campaign, the President at long last is taking certain steps to bring the war in Vietnam to an end. We hope and pray that those steps will succeed, but we can only ask with some note of sadness tonight, why, Mr. Nixon, did we have to wait for 4 years? Why did we have to wait to the closing hours of this campaign to move for a settlement of this war that from all indications could have come years ago?
Now we must draw the painful conclusion that the events of recent weeks were not a path to peace, but a detour around Election Day. The officials who are sworn to serve you instead have sought to mislead you for their own political gain. Their strategy, I believe, was designed to create the illusion of peace from Thursday, October 26th, when Dr. Kissinger made his announcement, until Tuesday, November 7th, when you will make your decision about the next President of the United States. Now, in a campaign that has been marked by falsehood, sabotage, secret funds, special interest deals, and actual criminal activity, this is the worst deceit of all. They have played politics with the Justice Department, the FBI, the Supreme Court, even the Constitution, and now they play politics with our prisoners and our soldiers and life itself. It is they who treat our men like toy soldiers to be knocked over by the hand that should protect them.
Well, I didn't know it then. But he did tell us that the United States. How long ago would that be?
Well, that's been several years ago.
So he said at that time.
On the bicentennial, because I certainly agree that we need to have friendly relations. We're having a good time. You seem to be having... We kind of low. We went up to Agra and took it easy for a few hours. That's beautiful. 14 years ago, but Eleanor had never seen it. Oh.
Reading about it, it seemed that you know that.
But we made tremendous progress.
I did it before it became popular. It doesn't take any courage, for God's sakes, to stand up against Vietnam now, in 1971, or even in 1968, after the whole thing has been revealed as a military and political disaster. It did take courage. When I stood up on the floor of the Senate in September of 1963 and said this war is a moral debacle and we ought to withdraw our forces right now or this will haunt us in every corner of the globe.
How do you react to former Attorney General Mitchell calling him a dupe of the communists?
Well, I think it's silly. Ramsey Clark is a loyal and patriotic American. He may have made a tactical error in offering criticism of American policy while he was in a foreign country. Personally, when I'm traveling abroad and I have criticisms of American policy, I hold them until I get home. But I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is whether or not we ought to be bombing the people of Vietnam, north or south. We ought to keep in mind that most American bombs are falling on the people of South Vietnam, not in the north, that we've now dropped some 7.5 million tons of bombs on those little agricultural countries in Indochina, which is about 3.5 times the total that we dropped on the entire world in the Second World War when I was a bomber pilot. And that is the issue, the question of whether this country can maintain its good name around the world while literally pounding the life out of tens of thousands of people in Southeast Asia. I think that's the issue that is raised by Mr. Clark. It's the one I've been raising now for about 10 years.
I always knew California was a big state, but I didn't know it would take so long to count the votes. These California polls remind me of the way they used to work for us a couple of months ago. Very slow, but ultimately rewarding.
And so I'm very grateful for the election returns that are now coming in California, in New Jersey, in New Mexico, and in my home state of South Dakota. I can't believe we've won the whole thing. I deny the label that I'm a one-issue candidate, but I welcome the long years of identification in opposition to this war. I still regard it as the most tragic mistake in all the history of this country. And I want every man and woman in this room and everyone within the sound of my voice to know that there is no higher or more sacred pledge that I take in this campaign for the presidency of the United States than my determination that if we win that election on November 7th and I'm inaugurated next January, we're going to end our military involvement in that tragedy once and for all. No secret plans, no secret deals, simply a recognition that we've got to love this country enough and put its interest high enough so that we recognize at long last the time has come to stop this senseless killing and tragedy and waste that is draining the very soul of this nation. I'm dedicated to that end, and I ask for your help in restoring this country to peace abroad, restoring our confidence here at home, and getting on with making America the kind of a great and good land that I think our people want it to be. Thank you very much.
Can you open up?
So what I'm saying in conclusion is that we desperately need here in this country a new set of national goals, a new set of priorities. We need, in short, to stop the bombing, the destruction, the killing that is going on in Southeast Asia, to stop the waste and the overkill in the military sector of our budget, and then to begin concentrating those resources on the works of health and hope and peace that our nation so desperately needs. That's the path in which I want to see America move. It's on that basis I ask for your help. Thank you very much. It's one, I think, of special urgency in the cities, and I want to commit myself again here this morning to doing everything within my power as a member of the Senate and as a candidate for the presidency of the United States to enlarging our health services in general, but specifically to doing more with this tragic problem of drugs. The drug problem, of course, is not only a matter of treatment, it's a problem of cracking down in a dramatic way in the enforcement end against the racketeers who are murdering our people in this illicit traffic.
just in these last few days, we have seen what would be in store for us if it were not for a Democratic Congress. We've seen Mr. Nixon veto the water pollution bill. We've seen him veto bills to rehabilitate our veterans. We've seen him veto bills to assist our education and relieve some of the burden on the property taxpayers of this country. We have seen him veto bills to improve the health care of our American people. This man is Mr. Veto, and there's only one way to get rid of him, and that's to veto him on next Tuesday.
How are you? Hello. How are you? Good to see you. Hi. How are you?
Hello.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
How are you? Hello there.
Thank you very much.
I might change my mind as time moves on, but at least for the time being, I can't see the priorities of it.
Okay, thank you.
The governor's vote on June 6th so that California will give the people of this country.
I have a presentation that I've been asked to make of a piñata, and it's going to go to a little boy by the name of Carlos. You can't see him, but I'm going to hold up his hand. Let me pick him up. Young blood of this country and the tax money of this country and the resources of the country will stop using those resources, destroying people in Southeast Asia, and begin using it to save people here in America. I say to Mr. Nixon and others who think like him that we can't go on wasting $250 million every week blowing up houses and schools and hospitals in Southeast Asia and still have the resources we need to build housing and hospitals and schools and to deal with the problems of crime and drugs right here in our own country. Now, we've had fair warning of the consequences of our vote. We now see before us a record of deceit and deception on Vietnam that has ended with the worst deception of all, not a peace in the name of humanity, but a hoax for the sake of politics in the closing days of this campaign. And I use those words thoughtfully and carefully. And everywhere the story is the same. It's the same with regard to the great issues that face us here on the domestic front. And once again, we are going to have to answer the basic question of whether we want a government of the comfortable or a government of the concerned. That is what is at stake in this election tomorrow. He assumes that people are so comfortable and so satisfied with his record of the past 4 years that he doesn't need to come to Portland to meet the people. He doesn't need to meet the press. He doesn't even need to discuss the central issues before the people of this nation. He's content to have others do a hatchet job on me, and I read these ads of distortion in the press. I see the distortions on the paid commercials on television that twist and distort my record until I don't recognize it as anything that even resembles what my position is on the great public questions of the day. Thank you very much. This is not the way politics has always been in this country, no matter what you might think, no matter what the president might say. I don't know of any time in the previous history of this country when a committee to re-elect the president, and also including White House officials that go right to the top of the presidency itself, have engaged in the kind of massive political espionage and sabotage and disruption of our democratic process that we have seen in this 1972 campaign. And I was glad to hear Governor Hearns express the faith that I have that the American people are essentially a good and a decent and a fair people, and they're going to reject those un-American and unethical tactics on next Tuesday. Let us assume that at long last the war is coming to an end. This means that the next president of the United States is going to direct his attentions primarily to healing the wounds that this war has opened here in our own society. It means that we must answer the question, which leadership and which party is best designed on the record to deal with the problems of the employment of our people who will be dislocated as a consequence of the end of this war, which party has had the best record, and which of the candidates competing in 1972 is most committed to the full employment of all of our citizens in this country who are able to work, which candidate and which party has a program to begin building up our cities, to begin dealing with the problems of environmental pollution, to begin dealing with the problems of public transit, the need for more schools, the need for better health care, the need to meet the problems of our older citizens. And I think when we raise those questions, it becomes clear that the Democratic Party and the Democratic candidates, George McGovern and Sergeant Shriver, are the ones who have consistently stood up for the working people of this country, who have insisted that full employment ought not only to be an ideal, but a realizable goal that we commit ourselves to. I think it's clear that it's the Sergeant Shriver, George McGovern Democratic leadership that will be best for the economy of this country in the post-war period.
Well, that's why we don't intend to lose. Not only do we want the presidency, but we want to win by a big enough margin so that this presidential and vice presidential effort will be a real political plus for the congressmen, the senators and governors and others who are running this year. I'm fully confident we're going to win the election. I think we're way ahead organization-wise of where the party was 4 years ago. Senator Humphrey has told me repeatedly in the last few days that the great advantage we have is an early convention. This is only the 9th of August. It was almost the 9th of September before the campaign got underway 4 years ago. We're ready to go now, and I think we're going to win.
Mr. Driver, I wonder if you could tell us if Senator Kennedy had any special advice or recommendations or suggestions for you.
He said that before Senator McGovern called me and discussed the nomination, he said that he would be very happy if I happened to be the nominee, and that he would work all out for the ticket, and that if I ever got the offer, to accept it as fast as I could.
We have learned that this network of political sabotage, of espionage, of forged letters, of wiretapping our Democratic National Headquarters, of deliberately trying to disrupt the democratic process, the forged letter that was written during the New Hampshire primary to embarrass Senator Muskie, and many of the other things that happened to divide and anger Democrats against others, we have learned that all of this was operated out of a $700,000 political espionage and sabotage fund that was controlled, yes, controlled and directed by the President's Chief of Staff in the White House, H.R. Haldeman. As one who for almost 10 years of service in the United States Senate has spoken out against this war for an end to the killing and dying at a time when Mr. Nixon has supported that war policy, I'm grateful, however late in the day it is, that he has finally come around to the possibility of a settlement. Let us hope that this is a report that will at long last lead to peace, and let us make sure that we do all in our power to back up every effort for peace, whether General Tu likes it or not.
We ask for your help. We need it. We know we can't win it alone. We know we can win it if we have your support. Thank you very much.
I want to tell you how impressed I am that after watching the people at this breakfast this morning leave the convention hall somewhere around 3:30 this morning, that there are so many of you here, not only at an 8:30 breakfast, but here with both eyes open and ready to start the fight of 1972.
Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China at an appropriate date before May 1972.
Yes, sir.
People of Manchester whom he has insulted, that he's lied to you about me. And thirdly, to say to him that by attacking me, by attacking my wife, he has proved himself to be a gutless coward. Maybe I said all I should on it. But it's fortunate for him he's not on this platform beside me. You're a good woman.
I did represent more of the average citizen in this country than did any other candidate, based on the fact that the man who works each day for a living and pays the taxes and holds the country together has been ignored, except on election day.
John Culver was one of the most respected members of the United States Senate. I've never heard any senator, Republican or Democrat, criticize him for his operations during his years in the United States Senate. He's a man of absolute integrity. He's a person of unusually high intelligence, a great sense of humor, and a dear friend of mine. I was a college history teacher. That was my first real job. I went through Northwestern University under the GI Bill, and then I went back to South Dakota to teach at a small liberal arts Methodist college, Dakota Wesleyan. I have reflected many times on how enjoyable that experience was, working with young minds in a college setting that was small enough you got to know most of the students and most of the faculty. And I think these small liberal arts colleges are the real jewels of the nation. Young people need to get involved in politics. They don't necessarily have to run for office, although that's not beyond imagination, but they should be actively involved in the politics of both the local community and also the nation. I think if they realize that coming from a small state like I did with only 700,000 population, that if I could do that and get elected to the United States Senate and then emerge as the presidential nominee of one of our two major parties, that it might be possible for anybody else to do the same. So that's why going around at these college functions means a lot to me.
Four years after the Chicago disaster, there was relatively little turmoil at the Democrats' 1972 convention in Miami Beach. The anti-war insurgents had won. They even made room at the podium for one of their loudest dissenters, Governor George Wallace of Alabama, who survived an assassination attempt during that year's primaries.
The average woman is the queen of American politics, and the average man is the king of American politics.
But the liberals leading the campaign of nominee George McGovern showed flaws in judgment and management. McGovern's vice presidential choice, Thomas Eagleton, would soon depart the ticket in a controversy over psychiatric treatment. And the convention proceedings were so loosely managed that McGovern accepted his nomination after midnight, with most Americans asleep.
The 35 hours and 45 minutes of sessions included 17 hours after midnight.
I'm happy to join you for this benediction of our Friday sunrise service.
McGovern's speech, less than a month after 5 men burglarized Democratic headquarters, didn't mention the word Watergate.
The Oregon delegation